Let's do that hockey.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 113 of the DPR show. Thanks for coming back. If this is your first time listening, thanks for joining. Today, this episode is going to be focused on the Detroit Red Wings, the winged wheel, and the prospects they've got in the roster and coming down the pipe. As you may know, I've been doing a series of top prospect ranking articles for NHL Trade Rumors, and today is going to be focusing on the Red Wings, and joining me to help break down their top 10 prospects and then maybe a couple honorable mentions is a good friend of the show, Mr. Victor Nuno. Victor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pete. Great to be on and really enjoy your show. So it's an honor to be here.
The honor is mine, man. And I had the honor of being on your show very recently, just about a week ago. We were talking all things prospects, guys rising and falling. So do me a favor, and if anyone listening to this show missed that one, let them know where they can find it.
Yeah, definitely. So Fantasy Hockey Life is our podcast, and we break down different prospects, risers, and fallers during the season. In the off season, we kind of go through each team and break down the whole team. So we had you on as one of our scout experts, and we have some more of those. We're also kind of doing an analytics series where we're going to bring on some of those guys like the Evolving Hockey and Hockey Viz. So that'll be fun as well. So Fantasy Hockey Life is where you can check that out. We kind of focus on Dynasty League. So if you're into that, then you should probably be listening.
Yeah, I'm sure most of the people that listen to this show are familiar with it. So hopefully they have caught a few episodes, or maybe if they haven't, they'll swing around and catch that. If for anyone who doesn't know Victor, Victor is also a writer for the Hockey Writers. I had a brief tour of duty there as well myself. So you can catch his coverings on San Jose Sharks there. And Victor, you do some stuff for Fantrax too. What exactly do you do for Fantrax? Because we're big fans of Fantrax on this podcast.
Yeah, our podcast is produced or pushed out and sponsored by Fantrax, and Jesse my co-host does some writing there. I do some in season. I tend not to do as much, but I do help with some of their rankings. So like we do the top forwards, D, and goalies, and I always contribute to that. And then we always do a show where we kind of break down the different rankings and stuff like that. So every once in a while I will write for them, but I'm usually so busy podcasting and writing for the Hockey Writers, I tend not to contribute as much to Fantrax HQ writing.
All right. And Victor is obviously a well-versed fantasy hockey expert and dives deep into the prospects as well. And let's talk about some Detroit Red Wings prospects. So before I jump into specific prospects, I like to kind of do a little overview of where the organization is. And I think it's pretty safe to say that under Yzerman, since he's come in, the team has been in a rebuild, and he's doing a really masterful job of restocking the cupboard. I mean, they had that very, very long playoff streak. I think it was like 25 years or something, just bananas. And so, obviously they stretched that out as long as they could. And at the expense of, holding on to veterans a little longer, maybe trading picks to help keep that playoff push streak alive. So, it's safe to say that hockey is a cyclical natured sport. You go up, you come down, and the Detroit Red Wings sure did go down hard. But they're on the way back up now. I'm really excited about their prospect pool for Detroit Red Wings fans. And in the last 5 years, they've done an incredible job of acquiring draft picks. They've had 52 picks in the last 5 years, 7 first rounds, 10 seconds, 11 thirds, 6 in the fourth, 5 fives, 8 in the sixth, and 6 in the seventh round. So not only have they had an immense quantity of picks, they've had an excellent quality of picks too. These aren't just, heavily loaded in the back end of the draft. They've picked early and often in the last 5 years, and they're starting to reap the benefits of that. they've got a number of players who are 25 years and under on the roster already. I'm looking at Philip Zadina, Michael Rasmussen, Dylan Larkin, Pius Suter, who they acquired via trade, and Alex Nedeljkovic they acquired via trade as well. Philip Hronik, and of course they've got their two Calder candidates on the roster this year, who we'll talk about right off the top. So before we jump into those two guys, did you have any thoughts on how the rebuild's going?
Well, I think that they did it right. That's my thought, is that they held on, as you said. They tried to do that, extend that streak, and they did. And when it finally came to an end, they were smart about it. I think they tried not to, just retool, or, you see some teams kind of like competitive rebuild, and they try to kind of extend things on a little bit. But I think they kind of tore it down pretty well, got a lot of good assets, and they picked really well. And so that leads you to where they are right now, which is more competitive than we all kind of imagined they would be. Of course, when you get some studs that are overperforming, or maybe performing as they should, you kind of get some great production. But I think they did it right, and I think there's the best is still yet to come. They have some really great young prospects here, and so can't wait to talk about them, because the future's bright in Detroit, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is. So they've got quality at the top and quality at the bottom too. Their depth of their prospects, I wouldn't say is second to none, because Los Angeles can probably lay claim to that title. But man, they're not far behind there in Detroit. And starting at the top two prospects, I mean, I really, really, really struggled to rank first and second between the likes of Lucas Raymond and Morits Seider. Quite frankly, I'm still undecided, but for the article, I had to choose one. I couldn't just split it, I suppose. Well, that's my article. I can do whatever I want, but I didn't. So I chose Seider as my number one prospect for them. Now, arguably, you could say both these guys have graduated, but I wrote this a little bit earlier in the season, so they were still eligible for, I think, consideration. I mean, you could make an argument that once they made the team, they weren't, because they're never going back. They started the season just so well. So I go 1-2 Moritz Seider and then Lucas Raymond. I suppose, depending on if you're looking at fantasy, you might want to reverse that ranking. And then depending on your league's format, you might kind of lean one way or the other as well. I'm really interested to hear what your take is on how you would rank these two, Victor.
Well, I started looking at your list, and I was thinking, I wonder if I'm going to disagree with Peter a little bit, because, I've looked at some of your other rankings and I like them, but sometimes there's always a guy here or there that I might, move around. But I think you did it right. I mean, first of all, for the team, I think there's no question that a number 1D stud is about the most valuable guy you can have, as opposed to maybe a top line center, right? So I think no question from that perspective, Mo Seider should be at the top. But I think also in fantasy, I wouldn't necessarily have thought that before this year. I mean, he has just been so impressive with his ability to step into the league and just, frankly, be fairly dominant, considering his age and like where, what he's done to this point. It's been really impressive. So I definitely have them in this position, because you also think about like the fact that he has been this good, and he is getting a pretty good amount of time on ice, but his peripherals are good, his shots are decent, and this is his first season in the NHL. It's his first 40 games. I mean, I can't imagine he's going to get worse, right? So, his 50-point pace is not buoyed by luck. All of his metrics are pretty in line. Of course, we don't necessarily know what they should be, but it's not like his PDO is high, his shooting percentage is 4, his IPP is in the 50s, which all of it seems pretty reasonable. And he's doing all this with a 43% ozone start. So when they get some guys that, can help carry some of the load, and maybe he can get slightly better deployment and not have to play all the tough minutes, because his time on ice versus elite competition is near the top of the team. And that's rough, but he's absolutely, all of his metrics are nearly a standard deviation above what an NHL mean player should be. Goals for, expected goals, goals against. He's fantastic. And I have a ranking over at Fantasy Hockey Life where I take into account peripheral shots and points upside. He's my number 1D prospect, under 100 NHL games played, ahead of Drysdale, Clark, Power, all those guys. So Yeah, I think he's going to be a top 10 D in just about any format for years to come. But in multi-category leagues, probably point 0.5. I wasn't sure that the points would be there before this year, but I think he's shown that he can create even without the best opportunity. And I think his opportunity and the surrounding cast is only going to get better.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like you're saying that he passes the analytics test with flying colors, and I think he also passes the eye test with flying colors too, right? Like, what would be if you could create out of clay a perfect NHL modern day defenseman? I think he would have size, about 6'4", 200 pounds, which is exactly what Seider is. He'd have to skate like the wind. He'd have to have great hockey IQ and sense and be able to read the game and process it at a high level, both offensively and defensively, see plays develop that allow him to create transition and offense and run a power play, but also allow him to eliminate lanes to the net, passing lanes, and force players wide, have good gap control. I mean, this guy does all those things really, really well. And he's only 20 years old, and he's doing it as a rookie in the NHL. So, yeah, I mean, for fantasy hockey, it's hard for me to rank defensemen over forwards, all things being equal, because forwards, fantasy hockey is largely driven by offense, right? Goals and assists. And Lucas Raymond's going to outscore Mo Seider every season. Or most of the time, anyways, if he's healthy and all that. Just by the nature of their positions, right? Raymond will be an offensive player relied upon to carry the load offensively, and Seider's a good two-way defenseman. But if your league has the peripherals, like you said, that's amazing. Or depending on the value of the depth in your league for defensemen, because there's only so many defensemen that score points, right? And if you're in a really deep league and all that counts for defensemen is points, then they kind of become a premium, because when that well runs dry sooner than later, and you haven't filled out your roster, you've got roster spots that are basically dead weight, right? Like guys that just don't contribute offensively, while other people might have, multiple defensemen that are contributing. And you can get offensive forwards that can contribute later on through your draft, right? So it's not like you're trading one for the other in that sense. So depending on the size and the format of your league, I could definitely make an argument either way for either of these guys being ranked. But, for the kind of leagues that you and I participate in, and I'd like to think the majority of the listeners, and then for NHL value straight up as well, those are the reasons I think I went with Seider with a thin edge at number 1 over Lucas Raymond at number 2.
Well, just a quick counterpoint or aside to that is that if you think about value over replacement, though, how many 60 to 65 to 70 point forwards are out there versus how many 50 to 55 point D that also put up the kind of peripherals that Mo does. I mean, nearly 2 hits a game, nearly 2 blocks a game, and, a couple shots along with the 50 to 55 point pace. That is incredible value that is really hard to find. So I think if you're just looking at, yes, Lucas Raymond is going to outscore Mo Seider most years, probably, unless there's some weird quirk or injury or whatever. But in terms of point pace, probably. But just in terms of, Raymond isn't bad at his peripherals. I mean, he's, like over half hit per game, a couple blocks here and there, and not that many shots, same number of shots as Seider. So it's not like he's an elite, peripherals monster. And 60 to 65 to 70 point forwards, don't necessarily grow on trees, but there are a heck of a lot more of them than there are defensemen that fill out those categories like Mo. So I would say it's number 1 with the bullet for me. I think that Seider is a little bit ahead just in terms of over replacement. But if you just look at the two individually and how great they are, yeah, it's kind of hard to say one versus the other. They're both so good.
I'd be happy to own either one on my fantasy roster. So let's talk a little bit specifically about Raymond. I think we're almost maybe underselling him by tooting the horn of Seider so hard that he's, this all around player and he has the peripheral stats and all that. And, so Raymond's not going to produce those peripheral stats like that. He's 5'10", 183. So while he's, an undersized winger, I would say he's already demonstrated that he's playing with adult man strength at the NHL at the age of 19. He's never going to be a banger. That's just not his game, but he does have a very high compete level, and he's very responsible defensively. So while he might not put up the peripheral stats that would maybe give him the edge in comparing these two, I think it's pretty safe to compare him to other players that the Red Wings fans would know, guys like Zetterberg and Hossa, who their NHL value, I think, in a way exceeds their fantasy value, because while he could be a 60, 80 point player, he's also a player you can put out to kill penalties, and with, the last minute of a period or a game, have a 1-goal situation either way, plus or minus a goal, you're going to want this guy on the ice. So he's got a lot of NHL value and very good fantasy value, but I think as good as his fantasy value is as a potential 60, 80 point player, his NHL value is even higher. Is that something that you kind of see with Raymond as well?
Yeah, he's a super smart player, and you watch him and you see the plays that he make, and that's what he always was kind of when he was, in the junior levels in the SHL too. And sometimes the points were a little bit underwhelming, but you saw the playmaking, you saw the positionally, and yeah, he's been good. I'm a little surprised that he did it as well as he did so far this season, because I know the Red Wings like to marinate their prospects, and he had kind of an underwhelming SHL D+1 season. I mean, William Eklund outperformed him in the SHL, and maybe that's says more about Eklund than it does about Raymond, but I just didn't see a huge progression from Raymond in the SHL. So I thought, okay, he's going to come and, dominate the AHL and then, be in the NHL next year. But he just was so good in training camp and preseason. And obviously we know what he's done since then. So yeah, it's been pretty impressive. It's funny too, looking at hockey prospecting, he has like almost the exact same analytical profile as Scott Gomez, who, had a pretty good career and was pretty good early on for the Devils, right? I mean, kind of jumped in and was like, that 60, 70 point player right away. And I feel like that's something that Raymond could do. But he definitely has some defensive work to do. I don't see him as like a bad defensive player, but like his expected goals against per 60 is really bad. So he needs to kind of clean up some of that work probably. But yeah, he's been really good. And, he definitely is a guy who, almost seems like he's arrived, right? And so, yeah, his peripherals may not be high, but he's someone who probably should be in that conversation for like a 60, 70 point forward, kind of moving forward. And that's pretty valuable, especially because he's done more with the goal scoring than he had previously. And I kind of always thought of him as a strong playmaking winger, but he worked on his shot all off season, and it's been way more dangerous, and he's got 11 goals so far in the NHL, and that's pretty great. He is doubled up on his assists, which is something you'd kind of expect from him, but definitely more goals than I would expect it at this point. So that's been nice to see the dual threat. You can't just back off of him or he'll pick you apart, but also you can't give him a clear shot because he'll burn you. So that's the kind of dual threat that you want to see.
Yeah, I mean, he's right out of, not right out of his draft, 1 year out, but bypassed the American Hockey League and went straight to the NHL upon coming to North America. And, the first couple, like 10 games of the season, he was a point a game player. Right now he stands at 32 points in 39 games. So he's in that neighborhood of being a point a game player as a rookie, which has become kind of rare these days. So yeah, I like his upside a lot as well. All right, so let's talk about the next guy. Let's move on back to the blue line. I went number 3 with Simon Edvinsson. Do you have any qualms with ranking him at number 3?
Nope, he definitely would be my number 3.
Right. So between their top pairing defenseman prospects, if you go Seider and Edvinsson, there are not very many teams that have a prospect pairing that are in that age group or prospects that can compare to that. I mean, you've got Buffalo maybe with Power and Rasmus Dahlin. That's very, very good. Colorado's got Cal McCarr and Bowen Byram. But Detroit's right up there with I think, what is the foundation to be an elite pairing defense partners in the NHL starting in the very near future. Like, just waiting for Edvinsson to get there, but Seider's already there.
Yeah, I mean, you put Seider and Edvinsson out there, and the ice is just going to tilt towards the other team. There's no question that's quite the luxury. You're absolutely right. And yeah, he's definitely a guy that I have to eat a little crow on personally, just because I was a little hard on him in his draft season, because a couple of times when I watched him, he made, what I considered some mistakes that he kind of did more than once. And I was really hard on sort of the hockey IQ, which is something that I value a lot. And we recently had a Swedish scout on our show, Jimmy Hamrin, who writes for EP Ringside. And he explained that Edvinsson was trying to expand his skill set and try some things that he hadn't done before. And that's maybe not the best thing to do in your draft season, but I guess other people saw it differently. And anyways, he explained that. And this season, he's kind of simplified and not done so much of that. And of course, he's looked amazing. And so that was his explanation of why he's looked so good. So I kind of like that. And I'm happy to, to backtrack a little bit about that on that. But yeah, I mean, definitely in hindsight, a great pick, just how well he's looked this season, and our brief window into the World Juniors, he was just amazing. So I hope we get to see another little bit of that, but absolutely. He's also a guy who looks like he'll be in the Seider mold in terms of the really good peripherals with some point scoring upside. He's already kind of, as an 18-year-old, rocking a 53% Fenwick with over a hit and nearly a shot, nearly a block a game and 2 shots. So that's amazing. He's going to probably fill categories for you. And again, like you said, if those two are your top pairing D, yeah, that's going to be really good. Detroit's going to be a really good team when all these guys mature.
Right. So he's 6'5", over 200 pounds. So he's got good size. And, typically you hear, oh, he skates well for his size when you talk about big guys that size, which I always thought was just a nice way of saying he's average at best. Like, I don't care if you're tall or short. You can either skate well, average, or below average, right? Like, I don't see what the size has to do with it, other than you can make the argument that guys who have an explosive growth spurt, who grow like, multiple inches in a very short time, need some time to adjust to the way their bodies change, and it can change the mechanics of your skating stride. So I get that a little bit, but it doesn't really change the fact that you're a good skater or a bad skater. So, but the thing about Edvinsson is his greatest asset is his skating, and he's 6'5" at 18 years old. So didn't have much of an adjustment period for him, unless he was 6'5" when he was like 12. And I think his vision is very good. I think he reads the game and reacts very well, and he has the quick first step foot speed to make adjustments, both in transitioning and rushing the puck up the ice, and closing gaps defensively. So yeah, I'm really excited for what these two can do together when the time comes that they're playing together. Or you could go with the role of one guy comes off, the other guy goes on, kind of thing. And just always have that presence on the ice at the same time. So the next ranked guy I have is in goal. I went with Sebastian Cossa, and this was interesting. The whole draft year last year, everyone was talking about Jesper Wallstedt and how he was the top ranked goalie, and he's being mentioned in prospect circles and rankings in the same kind of breath as guys like Spencer Knight and the Russian goalie whose name escapes me at the moment.
Askarov.
Yes, Askarov, thanks. And then Sebastian Cossa just kind of sneaks in the back door there and gets to be the top picked player. And it's not like he's coming out of nowhere. He's in Canada. He's playing in the WHL. Pretty Edmonton Oilers Kings, pretty common league there that a lot of scouts and prospect writers know about. So do you think that it's Kossa's stock that elevated in the draft year and he just surpassed Wallstedt? Or do you think Wallstedt maybe kind of stumbled a little bit?
Oh, I personally, I was Team Wallstedt all the way. In fact, I wrote about this over at the Hockey Writers, and I kind of wanted the Sharks to pick him just because I feel like that would have filled the hole for years and years to come, because I think he's really good. And I don't think Wallstedt has done anything so far to, make Minnesota regret taking him. I mean, he was where he fell to was just criminal. I mean, to be able to get a player of that quality at 20th overall is just pretty silly. But I was Team Wallstedt for a couple of reasons. One in that he was facing, professional shooters at such a young age and doing really well. And his expected goals above goal conceded were really high. That's a stat that Instat has. And so that's one thing. He's also very technical. So Cossa is, a very different kind of goalie. He's very, very big. And also it's a little bit tricky in that he plays for just a dominant WHL team, right? I mean, the Oil Kings they've been so good and continue to be. And it's not like he's been bad when he's performed elsewhere, but it really just hasn't happened, right? I mean, he hasn't had the opportunity to play in the World Juniors or anything like that. So we haven't seen him elsewhere, and he won't be able to face professional shooters even until next season if he's in the AHL. So that's just something that kind of bugs me a little bit. And I definitely am Team Wallstedt. In fact, the hot take that I had in the draft year was that Ben Gaudreau was closer to Cossa than Cossa was to Wallstedt. That's my hot take for there, and we'll see how that works out. I do like Ben Gaudreau. That was even before the Sharks took him. That had nothing to do with that. But I just think that Wallstedt was the head of that class, and I was pretty shocked that Detroit moved up to take him. But I also feel like they probably know some stuff that I don't, and their picks have been working out for them. So I am sure it'll be fine, especially we just talked about this impressive decor. If Kossa's in front of a really good defensive team, I think he'll be good enough to, not have to worry too much about making amazing saves. So I think he can probably perform in that situation, but he has a ways to go. He's got to face professional shooters at least for a year or two. And I think that he'll be fine, but I probably wouldn't have had him quite as high on this list just because he's a goalie and he's a ways out. And I wasn't as high on him as some other people.
Well, this isn't a very contrarian episode because I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. I also really like Ben Gaudreau. In fact, I traded up to get him in the second or third round of one of my fantasy leagues too. I think he's a little bit underrated. I think he slipped under the radar with the lack of OHL play last year. But back to Edmonton Oilers, guys, and Cossa. Yeah, a little bit of, not a red flag, but a grain of salt, I would say, with his record last year. It was incredible, right? 17-1-1 and a 157 goals against average. And the grain of salt there is the Edmonton Oilers Kings were a really, really good team. Short season, right? So, 20 some games. And they play it in a kind of a weak division. So quality of competition in his division was a little soft, and he's playing against guys 19 and under. So when he gets thrown into a pro league, and gets a large sample size with pro-sized players and at a better quality of competition. That'll be really interesting to see what happens to his stock at that point. And as well, the Red Wings got Nedeljkovic, who's not on this rankings, although I think technically he could be. He's eligible for the Calder Trophy again this year. So they can spend their time slow cooking Cossa and, let him percolate either in the Coast or in the AHL for a couple of seasons until he's good and ready. So hopefully everything pans out for him. If everything breaks well for him, I mean, he's 6'5", I think it is 6'6". So usually when goalies are that big, they tend to rely on being shot blockers and playing the angles and filling the net. But he's also very athletic. So he's got that nice combination of being a good positional shot blocker that, tracks plays nicely. He can see over defensemen if he needs to, has good rebound control. And on those occasions where he needs to be athletic to make a recovery or a second or third save, he's got that skill set too. So there's quite a bit to like about him. Moving on, we're getting to number 5 now. So to recap the top 5, we went Mo Seider, Lucas Raymond, Simon Edvinsson, Sebastian Cossa, and number 5, I've got Jonathaan Berggren. How do you like him at number 5?
Yeah, it's definitely the next guy I would have had there. Don't worry, we might disagree a little bit later, so but not yet. I love Berggren, and I probably would have just put him above Cossa just because, like I said, goalies are tough. And he's been fantastic, Berggren, since the Red Wings picked him, second round pick in 2018. It's taken a while, but he really popped off in that COVID season 2020-21 for Skellefteå, 45 points in 49 games. And helped them all the way to the semifinal, where they came up just a little bit short to Mo Seider's former team for Rogla. But Berggren was in the AHL this season. I thought that, he might benefit from playing with Raymond, but of course, Raymond being in the NHL, Berggren had to do it a little bit more by himself. But 21 points in 27 AHL games suggests he's kind of, moved to North America just fine. And he's really good offensively. He's got really good tools. His hockey IQ is off the charts. He knows where to be to get open. He can accept passes really well. His shot is good. All of those tools are really good. The thing that really worries me a little bit is that defensively, he's not necessarily bad, but he can be a little bit of a giveaway turnover machine that can feed the other team. So, when he's on a team that isn't as good, then or doesn't play with pretty good defensive players, then it can be a bit of an issue. But the comp that I really like for him is Andreas Johansson. He looks a lot like him in the hockey prospecting model, and I think that's a good comp too, because Johansson is kind of a black hole defensively, not very good. But if you put him with a good defensive player, he can be a really good offensive player, and we've seen that throughout his career a couple times here and there. And so I think Berggren could be like that, especially if he gets to play with a really strong playmaker like Raymond or a good, center like Larkin. I think that he can clean up a lot of those, issues that he has there. So, yeah, I really like Berggren. I feel like he's, going to be a pretty decent complementary player. Certainly doesn't have like the upside, I think, of a Raymond offensively. But he's definitely a guy that should be part of this team moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, he had a breakout season over in the SHL, and now he's come over to North America and really just hit the ground running, right? Like, just not having any hiccups in his game at all. As you mentioned, his point totals this season are very impressive. 8 goals, 23 points, about 0.8 points per game. As a rookie, that's just fine with me. So, yeah, I think he gives them a lot of good offensive depth and insulation at forward. And he's not very far away from being NHL ready by all accounts. So I think one of the biggest challenges the Red Wings might have will be fitting them into the roster and what kind of roster spot they can give him. They've got Vladimir Nemestikov is expiring. Sam Gagne is expiring. So those are two players that, are around their 30s that will probably not be invited back. Other than that, that's pretty much the only expiring contracts they have. So if they can fit him into a top 6 by losing one of those guys, then that might be the way to go. Slipping down the list here, I have number 5. Now, some people might think this is high and some people might think this is low, but I went with Joe Veleno at number 6. So everyone's pretty familiar with the file, exceptional status in the queue, lots of hype about him, high draft pick, looked really good for Team Canada at the World Juniors, and has been good in the American Hockey League when he's played there, and just not really finding his groove at the NHL level at this stage in his career. So some people might be thinking, he's a bust. He was a waste picking him where they did. And other people will be like, no, he's just fine. He's, sure, he's only got, like 4 or 5 points this season in 23 games, but he's don't expect him to be a superstar player, but he is a very valuable player. He's a good two-way center that can provide offense and can also play a good shutdown role. That's, I think, what they asked him to work at the American Hockey League level, because he established his offense in the queue, no question there. And with Team Canada, he showed he can be a valuable offensive contributor. That's not translating to the NHL, but he did learn and evolved his game, maybe rediscovered himself as a two-way player in the American Hockey League. And I think that is going to that's going to make him an NHL regular for, I think, a long time. Just maybe not an offensive superstar, but a very good third line center. That's sort of my take on Veleno. Where do you come in with him? And would you have him ranked higher or lower than where I have him at 6?
Yeah, this is where we get to disagree.
Nice.
Which is always fun. Yeah, I would have left him off my list completely, frankly. And maybe that's a bit of a hot take, but yeah, I think we can agree that he is not the offensive dynamo that we thought at one point he could be, right? I mean, I don't think it was a mistake necessarily to take him where he was. I mean, he was great. He was great for Canada, helped them win gold. He was, good in the Q. I guess some people will say like, oh, but the Q is always a high scoring league. Okay. But still, like I don't think that was necessarily a mistake in that draft. In hindsight, of course, maybe doesn't look as good. And you can point to other guys that he maybe should have been taken. But the reality is, as you said, the progression has been a bit troubling. I don't know that he's learned how to play defense in the AHL. I mean, his Fenwick is 47% in the AHL this season. I guess that's a smaller sample size. It was a little bit better last season. So he's kind of gotten a little bit better in the AHL in terms of that. So yeah, and certainly he doesn't have a huge sample size of NHL games total. He has 28. In that time, though, he's been pretty average or below average defensively, and he's pretty much a black hole offensively. So the guy that we thought could provide some offense hasn't really. I mean, his expected goals are 3 standard deviations below the mean. That's really bad, for generating offense. So I think at this point, if he could be a bottom 6 center, that maybe contributes a little bit of offense, and maybe if you put him against a little worse quality of competition, that he could stick in the lineup, that would be a win for the Red Wings. I for fantasy though, I personally would sell all shares of Joe Veleno if I could. And I had previously, and I sold them, and I'm thankful for that, because I just don't think he's ever going to be a guy that's super valuable. I mean, you look at his comps, Evolving Hockey does these comps and Hockey Prospecting. He looks like a guy somewhere between Luke Kunin and Colin White. And think about if you want those guys. Not really. I mean, they don't really provide much, maybe some bangs. I don't think he's going to provide as many bangs as Luke Kunin. So, I don't know that he's going to be a super valuable guy. He's probably better than a 15-point pace guy, which is what he's been in his NHL career. Of course, like I said, small sample size. But I don't know that he's ever going to be above like a 35-point pace guy. And so, yeah, unless it's like a super deep dynasty where you just want guys that are playing games, then I don't know that he's someone that's valuable, which for me, when I'm doing these rankings, if I feel like a guy has kind of shown like he's not going to have that upside, we talk about this funnel theory that Jesse came up with. Early on in their career, guys have a wide range of outcomes. And as they get closer and closer to the NHL, their range of outcomes narrows, right? You go down the funnel. And Joe Veleno has sort of a narrow range of outcomes at this point, which I think is bottom 6 center, 3rd or 4th line. And that's only if he can get much better defensively. And that doesn't really scream someone that you want in fantasy. So that's why I would just leave him off the list entirely.
I did sell my stock in Joe Veleno in my fantasy league that I owned him in as well. So, I guess I kind of agree with you with a lot of what you're saying there, but and his draft stock he was kind of a little bit like Atu Radi, where his draft stock a year or two before his draft was super high. He was projected as a top prospect for the draft. And then he ended up getting picked 30th overall. So just squeaked in to the first round. So still ended up being a first round pick. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that he maybe could have slid a little further down. And that might have kept his value in perspective for where he's at now. But he's certainly not trending in the right direction. It started just before his draft and it has continued on through. I still think that he has an opportunity to play in the NHL and be a valuable NHL player. But as far as his fantasy value goes, I would agree he's going to be good for face-off wins if he plays a center.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on. Number 6. I went back to the wing and forward with Theo Niederbach. 5'11", Swedish winger, 19 years old, drafted in the second round of the 2020 draft. over in the SHL this year for a second or third season that he's at now. He's got 7 points in 31 games, so he's not scoring at a prolific rate there. He did look good for Sweden at the World Juniors, though. In the 2 games, he had 2 goals. That's pretty impressive. So what's your take on Niederbach?
Yeah, he's an interesting player, finally playing full-time in the SHL, as you mentioned. After last season, he was split between all 3 levels there, Svenskan, J20, and SHL. 7 points in 31 games isn't great for the almost 20-year-old, but he's getting under 10 minutes a night. And, for Lunda being such a quality organization there and being such a good team, they don't necessarily give their young guys a lot of opportunity. But it is great to see that he's driving play 52% Fenwick when he's out there for that under 10 minutes. Doesn't shoot a lot, but again, his role isn't great. He's kind of trending down in terms of like his points upside, but again, it may not be the opportunity. So he's kind of looking more like an average or replacement level producer. But again, I think that a renaissance like Berggren showed is not out of the question. Like if he gets more opportunity next season, like he could really pop off in his D+3 season. So I think that still is possible. I'm not to the point where I am with Veleno, like, pack it in. He's probably not going to do much. I think that the stock is definitely down on Theo Niederbach, but I think that he certainly could turn it around and be still a pretty decent complementary player. So we'll see. Next season is going to be a big one. I'm not sure how much we can expect from the Teddy Wing Niederbach, but maybe he pulls it out and is someone who can actually contribute to the team. But I wouldn't hold out a huge amount of hope for him.
You think I have him ranked a little high?
Yeah, maybe. I think your next guy we'll talk about, I probably would have moved him up.
All right. Yeah. So what I like about Niederbach, my optimism for him holds on that, he's 5'11", 172. So he's a little physically underdeveloped at this stage. If he can add some bulk and strengthen up a little bit, I think you might see the offense that he showed at the junior level catch up with him at the pro level. So we'll wait and see if that comes to fruition or not. Next, I go back to the blue line, another defenseman in the Red Wings system. Man, their defense is deep. 6 foot 168, Albert Johansson, playing in the SHL. Another fleet-footed defenseman. He skates really, really well, starting to show some offensive chops as well as he develops. Covers a lot of ice. Very good at transition, joining the rush, leading the rush. The offensive side of his game is still coming along, but he's got that element to his game. I don't think he'll be a power play specialist necessarily at the NHL level, but he's not very physically intimidating either. But the way he skates and reads the game I think is going to serve him very well in the NHL and make him a very good middle six kind of defender. So you like where I have him here, or maybe a little higher?
I probably would have moved him all the way up to 5, frankly. I would have moved him up quite a bit. I really like Albert Johansson. And part of it's hard when you have Mo Seider and Simon Edvinsson in your prospect pool. It's kind of hard to give airtime to Johansson, but he's just been really good. He's probably a bit underrated. There really just aren't a lot of weaknesses in his game, as you mentioned. He's such a pain in the butt to play against. He's tenacious, he's aggressive, but he's such a good skater that he recovers well, good at denying entries. He kind of reminds me of a Shark player, Mario Ferraro. Just like so active and so tenacious and aggressive. He's kind of projecting to be sort of an average point producer in the NHL, but he's got solid periffs. And as you mentioned, probably a middle pairing guy. So that's good. Or, if they end up splitting up Seider and Edvinsson, then he'll get to play with one of those two. That could be really good. And yeah, I would have had him a little higher on this list, but he's not going to pass Edvinsson or Seider. But he might end up having similar peripherals to those guys. And, I mentioned my ranking list earlier. He's 44th D on my list. So he's pretty high. I mean, these Red Wings have a lot of guys on the list. They're doing pretty well. So I think, in terms of like value, Johansson probably is someone that you might be able to acquire at a little bit lower cost and could be not too far off from someone like Edvinsson. So that might be a good, strategy.
Yeah. Hey, guess what? The next guy on the list is another defenseman. They are loaded at D. So quick recap here, just to kind of go back a little bit. We started with D with Morits Seider. Then we went Lucas Raymond, Simon Edvinsson, defenseman, Sebastian Cossa, goalie, Jonathaan Berggren, a winger, Joe Veleno, a center, Theo Niederbach, forward, and then defenseman Albert Johansson, and now another defenseman, William Wallinder. So he's a 2020 second round pick, 32nd overall. Again, another really big defenseman, 6'4", 190, and he's starting to show some offensive chops as well. His offense in the SHL is coming along. He's got 4 goals and 12 assists in 27 games with a Rogel. So that's not bad for a defenseman playing in that league at that age. That's actually quite impressive. What's your take on this tall defenseman?
Yeah, they have such a good collection of them. Well, this is a guy actually who I had on my Dungeons and Dragons list, my do not draft list, during that draft. And you know, as you sort of profiled, has all of the physical tools, right? I mean, he's someone who projects to be an NHL defender. He's got the size, the physicality, skates well. And that's like catnip to NHL GMs. The problem, I think, is his hockey IQ. And I think that I sort of said the same thing about Edvinsson, but he showed a dramatic improvement, and maybe some of that was miscast in his draft year. But Wallinder has really not shown a tremendous improvement in that area. So that's something I worry about. I actually, during the 2020 draft talk, I called him the Swedish Rasmus Ristolainen, which, you know, you can look at Ristolainen and say, whatever, he's still an NHL defenseman. He still gets bangs and he's still valuable in fantasy. Maybe his decision making isn't great, but he's still out there because of all of his physical tools. So that may be what Wallinder does. And you're going to need someone tough in front of the net to be physical. And maybe he does that as like a third pairing guy. And that wouldn't be fine. But maybe he also ends up as a 7th or 8th defender because he just can't figure out some of the defensive reads. I don't know. But even his peripherals aren't amazing. So that's something that, you know, in fantasy should worry GMs a little bit. And his Fenwick in the SHL is only 45%, so not a great play driver. Rogla is a great team, and he's not doing so well. His expected goals is also not so good. So I don't have any shares of William Wallinder, but if I did, I would probably sell them. Maybe to you.
Yeah, I'd be interested. His play's improved since he's moved from Moto over to Rogel. So there is that. I think he's trending in the right direction for me, but there, like you said, his decision making is making him a bit of a red flag kind of player. And those are sort of inherent flaws. You know, you look at Sean Day. Sean Day might be a good example. He's a big mobile defenseman as well that has shown he can provide some offensive flash and panache, but his decision making is just so flawed that he's never gonna. I don't think he'll make it to the NHL. He might get a couple cups of coffee, maybe play close to a season or something like that in total. But so hopefully Wallinder doesn't fall into the same bust kind of category. You know, I have him ranked 9th, so he barely cracks the top 10. But like I said, it's a pretty deep stacked roster of prospects. So, you know, we'll move on a little bit here and we'll talk about some other guys, and you might convince me that I have him ranked a little high. You can probably make a good argument that this guy's a little high too. Number 10, Jared McIsaac. He's now 21 years old, and he was a 2nd round pick by the Red Wings back in 2018. And he had a really, really, really good junior career playing in the Q with Halifax. 1 gold with Canada at the Hlinka, and again at the World Junior Championship. Not so much an offensive defenseman. He's got a little bit of that to his game, but he's certainly more defensive and physical. Good kind of two-way defenseman, skates pretty well, and he's got decent size, 6 feet, 190. You can just make the argument that he's not progressed enough to maintain the prospect status that he had when he was in the queue. Would this guy make your top 10? Do I have him a little high?
Probably, yeah, Well, those are two different answers there. Probably high for me, but wouldn't make my top 10. But I understand why you have him there. He has lost so much development time, and that is difficult. So obviously could go two different ways. Like he just never recovers from that, and he's just never really puts it all together in the NHL, which I would say is probably the more likely outcome. But also he could take some time and figure it out and become the player that he always could be. I think if that happens, though, he's probably not more than a good two-way third pairing guy. So I don't know that the upside is huge in terms of fantasy. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely a guy who's worth like mentioning. But I just don't know that the upside is huge. And I hope for his sake and the Red Wings' sake that it works out. I wouldn't have a whole lot of stock in him.
No, but I think if he does make the NHL, he would have a little bit more value in the leagues that have multi categories, because I think he'll be a block and hit machine and the occasional little bit of offense, but probably not playing enough minutes to really make him worthwhile. Unless you've got minor eligibility where you can move guys up and down from your prospect roster to your active roster while he maintains minor eligibility, there might be some value there because you can stream him in and out of your roster, and when injuries kind of come around, he might be something when you can pull up kind of thing. But other than that, yeah. Okay, so that's the top 10. Just a quick recap again. We go Seider, Raymond, 1-2, Simon Edvinsson, Sebastian Cossa, Jonathaan Berggren, Joe Veleno, Theo Niederbach, Albert Johansson, William Wallinder, and Jared McIsaac. That is my top 10 rankings. So you said you had a couple guys that wouldn't have cracked this roster. I think you said that about 2 or 3. So who would be 1 or 2 players that, in the honorable mentions category that you would have moved up into your top 10 that I kind of snubbed a little?
Yeah, well, I could see why maybe you left a couple of these guys off, but I think it's worth mentioning Alex Cotton and Red Savage. And the reason is Alex Cotton is a guy who has an outstanding offensive toolkit. I understand the skating is definitely a bit of an issue for him, but he's been fantastic in the WHL. He's a defenseman, by the way, if I didn't say that. And he's been over a point per game for Lethbridge in 2021. And he's been just under a point per game. He got traded to the Vancouver Giants after 8 games. And he's just been great. So, I mean, he knows how to run a power play. He can score at even strength. And yes, maybe he's got some issues, defensively and skating, but he's a guy who statistically profiles like Chris Letang. And he's got some other good comps like Brent Seabrook, Thomas Shabbat. So he's a guy that if he hits, he could be really good. So it's probably worth like having a share of him, because also you'll probably know pretty soon with another year or two whether he just can't hack it in the AHL. So we'll find out. But Alex Cotton is someone I think is worth looking into. And then the other guy is Red Savage, who was an absolute steal in the 4th round, I think, for the Red Wings. I mean, they draft so well. And he's a guy who jumped from the USNTDP, so USHL level, to NCAA. And so his points has taken a bit of a hit this season, but he's still been good. 12 points in 21 games for Miami University of Ohio, who is not a great NCAA team, not a powerhouse anyways. And he's been good. And so he's a guy who, if he makes it, he's going to be a peripherals monster, because he's already pretty much a hit and a block per game in the NCAA. Even though he doesn't shoot a whole lot, he's going to get out there and just rack up hits and possibly PIMs. He's notably got a misconduct in just one of the 2 World Junior games that USA played. So, he definitely has some grit to him, and he's the guy that I could see making it just for that role. And if he has more offense, that it seems like he might, then, maybe he could contribute some points too. So Red Savage is a guy who I think, might surprise, and it's worth kind of holding on to that lotto ticket. Also, especially because he was a 4th rounder, he might not be rostered in your league. So it's probably worth going to check, and maybe you can fit him in on your dynasty team.
All right. So those are 2 names that didn't make my honorable mention. So I'm really glad you brought those up, because, I like learning about players that I maybe need to pay more attention to. And you bet I'm going to look up Red Savage in my fantasy league. One of the couple of the players I had on my honorable mentions, I had Robert Mastrosimone. I like him. I've seen him play a couple of times watching some Boston Terrier games. He's a highly skilled player. I'm not really sure why his offense isn't translating more consistently at the NCAA level. It's starting to pick up a little bit this year, but I think he's 21 years old now, 2021, whatever it is. But he's a highly skilled player. He does he's got quick hands. He does the toe drags and all that stuff. But his career stats at the NCAA, he's got long stretches of not producing. So far this year, he's got 15 points through 21 games, which is 0.71 points per game, which is good, but not great. He's a second round pick. So I'm kind of trying to decide if this is a player who I think can find a way to put it all together and is worth holding on to in deep leagues with a lot of prospects, or is this someone who, at this stage in his career, it's time to look elsewhere at other prospects who have more potential and upside. He's only 20 years old now, but last year he had 8 points in 15 games, and the year before that, his freshman season, he had 17 and 34. So he's about a half a point a game player up until now, where he's starting to get a little bit better. Do you have a take on Simone?
If I had him, I would dump him from my team. I mean, the thing is that I always hate saying what seems like negative things about these guys, because I want everyone to be successful, but I just don't think that as a junior, who's someone who didn't score a ton and had his first 2 seasons in the USHL. I mean, I just don't know that there's enough offense to be a big time contributor. So like if he makes it, he might be like a bottom 6, contribute 20, 30 points kind of thing. So I just don't see him having a huge impact. That's Mastrosimone. I don't see it happening, but we'll see. But I would sell or dump him if I had him.
Fair enough. Now, another player that some people might have caught wind of at the World Juniors recently, not this one, but the one before, Elmer Soderblom. He's a really big, hulking forward, Swedish-born, and he is 6'8", 202 pounds. And at the World Juniors last year, he had 3 points in 5 games. But what really stood out for me there was his net front presence was excellent. And not only was he using his ginormous frame to cause all kinds of traffic problems in front of the net on the power play, he also showed he's got some pretty silky mitts for a guy that size. He scored a between the legs goal in front of the net. So I'm kind of keeping him on my radar. Playing full-time in the SHL this season. He's got 11 goals and 16 points through 31 games. So twice as many goals as assists, which is interesting. What's your take on Big Soderblom?
My take was the same as yours, that, obviously he's noticeable because he's huge, and you think he could use that to his advantage, and he does. I mean, he could be a little bit more physical than he is because, he is so big.
Yeah.
But his hands, man, for a guy that big, and he can skate well. I know you hate that. Oh, he's big. He can skate well, though. But he can skate pretty well. But his hand, he had really soft touch around the net and through the legs goal and some nice deflections. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have the huge statistical profile in terms of putting up points early on that makes me think he could be a huge contributor. But guys who are 6'8", who can skate and have good hands are going to get opportunity, right? We're not talking about a 5'8" here guy. We're talking about a 6'8" guy. And I think he just gets the opportunity, and he turns into anything close to the next Holmstrom. Well, then, things are going to be just great for him. So I could see him making it just for that role, because I mean, that's really valuable, right? To be able to plop him in front of the net and, clean up some rebounds and deflect and screen the goalie. So yeah, absolutely. Elmer Soderblom is someone who I think is interesting. And interesting side note, he is, his brother is Arvid Soderblom, who is a goalie for the Chicago Blackhawks, who's in their development system, Rockford IceHawks, and he's pretty decent. So that's kind of fun.
Right on. Yeah, certainly going to keep an eye on him. I can't wait to see what he does when he comes to North America. That could move the needle pretty quickly in one direction or another, depending on how he transitions over here. I'd like to think that because he's so big, the smaller ice surface would would benefit him because, he can just create his own space just by being big and strong. One last player on the list I want to talk about, a player who I own in a couple of my leagues. So I'm a little bit personally invested in him. So I'm always curious to get other people's takes on him. That's Taro Hirose. So Michigan State University alumni, played a couple years there. Very, very good. Signed as a free agent, undrafted. So he is now 25 years old, right? Like, he is what he is. He's not going to develop anymore. And it doesn't look like he's got the NHL chops. His NHL career is 43 games, 13 points, 3 goals, 13 assists. But at when he signed his contract, he played the final 10 2019 games with the Red Wings, and he had 7 points in 10 games. So, I was very keen on him. He was one of the hottest sought after NCAA free agents that season. Signed with the Wings. I figured, great, rebuilding team, lots of opportunity for a prospect there. Then he hit the ground running at the NHL with 7 points in 10 games. My enthusiasm went through the roof, albeit that's a small sample size at the end of the season. Then the following season, he played the majority in the NCAA, 27 and 35. Last year, again, 29 games in the American Hockey League, 28 points. This year, 30 games in the American Hockey League, 27 points. So he's a point-a-game player consistently in the American Hockey League, but just not able to produce it at the NHL level. I think his skating might be a concern there. I'm not sure if you have much of a tape on Taro Hirose, but I'd be really interested to see what your take is on him.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of laid out the evidence there. He's a tweener. He's a guy he's good in the NCAA. He's good in the AHL. Just, I don't know that he can hack it in the NHL. 43 games is not a huge sample size, but what we have seen shows that pretty much all of his metrics are below what an average NHLer should be. Defensively, offensively, expected goals, Corsi, all that's not great. So what does he do? What does he bring to the table? He's not great defensively, not even good defensively. He's not great offensively. I don't know why the Red Wings would keep giving him chances. So feel bad saying that, but if I could give you permission to drop him, I would, Peter.
I think you can give me that blessing if you so choose. I think that's something you can get away with. Well, this is his last season. He'll be a restricted free agent after this season, and based on the depth of their prospect pool, I think they might let him walk as a free agent and just open up that contract spot for some of the younger players. And he's obviously a prolific scorer at the American Hockey League, so he's gobbling up prime minutes in Grand Rapids. And if you don't think that he has an NHL future, then that your American Hockey League is a development team. It's for developing young players. So it might be time for the Red Wings to part ways. Maybe an opportunity in another organization would be what he needs. But if you can't crack the Red Wings roster, then I'm not sure there's an NHL roster that he can crack. Any other last minute players you want to just kind of slip in under the radar there just before I wrap this episode up?
Well, I think that there's a really interesting Russian player named Kirill Tyutyayev, which you probably would never guess how to spell unless I told your listeners. So it's Tyutyayev. It doesn't sound like how it's spelled, but it's Tyutyayev. And he's a really small, undersized Russian. He's 5'8" and or 5'9", I guess. And he's a 7th round pick. And so you never expect too much out of those guys, but he is highly, highly skilled, very creative with the puck, and someone who could, offensively, put up points. And so that's exciting. He came to their camp and was impressive. And I almost thought like, wow, he might even make the team. But no, he's in Grand Rapids, 3 points in 9 games. He's adjusting to North America. So, he might take some time if he even makes it. But, guy was found money in the 7th round. So, he's just a guy that, maybe if he could put things together is interesting. And then I just also think the goalies are worth mentioning, Jan Bednar and Victor Brattstrom, who are both transitioning to North America. And that transition can be tough. I still think it's Cossa. I still think you were right to put Cossa up there because it's probably his team down the road to lose, but you never know with goalies. So if it's not Cossa, it might be Bednar or Bratstrom, or it might just be Nedeljkovic for a decade. So you never know. But yeah, those guys are probably worth just kind of mentioning briefly.
Yeah, well, that's like, I don't know, the top 17. And there's still some other players that we haven't mentioned that I think would have been worth mentioning. Antti Tomasito, Shai Buum, Donovan Sabrango, who's, playing in the American Hockey League and made the Canadian World Junior roster as well. Would have liked to have seen Sabrango. He's a Kingston boy as well. So, a little bit near and dear to me that way. So like I said, right off the top, this is a prospect organization pool that is very deep, both in quality and quantity of players. And the challenge they're going to have in a few years is how can you fit all of these guys onto a 25-man roster? You can't. So some of them are going to flame out and solve that little problem, and they might have to move a couple of these guys, package some up. We've seen teams do that before. Carolina did it recently. They traded off a couple of their prospects just because they had too many. I think you might see LA do something like that. The Los Angeles Kings have a deep pool, and it might be time for them to try and maybe package a couple of them together and maybe a pick and land a guy like Jacob Chychrun or something like that's young and not a aging out veteran, is still in his prime, but can help them speed up their rebuild and give them a quality piece right away. I think the Red Wings might be able to try and pull something off like that in a little bit of time once some of these guys ripen up a little bit. All right, so that's going to put a wrap on episode 113. I want to really thank my guest, Victor Nuno, for coming on and bringing the heat on this episode. That's some really great information you had there, Victor. You obviously did your homework for this episode. I really appreciate that. Listeners, give him a follow on Twitter at Victor Nuno 12, VICTORNUNO 12. That's your Twitter handle, right? I got that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Listen and subscribe to his podcast at Fantasy Hockey Life. You can follow him on Twitter at Fan Hockey Life. Catch his ramblings and writings at the Hockey Writers, covering the San Jose Sharks. And I get great guests on this podcast, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And thanks, Victor, for bringing the goods today. I really enjoyed this chat, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. It was really a lot of fun. So I hope the listeners enjoyed it too.
Right on. All right, everyone. That's it for this episode. I got an episode recording tomorrow night for the Edmonton Oilers. So we're going to have some rapid fire DPR after a month off with Christmas holidays and life getting in the way of me finding time for a podcast. But I'm still at it. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.